Welcome back, Dr. JC here, part 2 of lecture 7. We're going to take a few minutes and take a peek at the rise of Islam and consider not just the impact of Muhammadan Islam, but specifically the impact of Muhammadan Islam on the Byzantine Empire and bringing about the collapse of the Byzantines and the eventual rise of the Ottoman Empire. So again, we'll take a few minutes here to talk about the rise of Islam. Clearly, any discussion about Islam has to start with its founder, Muhammad. While historians don't know a lot about his early life, it is thought that perhaps he was a foreign trader, so he was a merchantman. And if that's the case, then clearly he would have had contact as a foreign trader with other civilizations in the region. Therefore, if he's in contact with other civilizations in the region, he's specifically in contact with their underpinning spirituality as well, whether it be Christianity, Judaism, or Zoroastrianism. So in some sense, he would have had an understanding of spirituality and the importance of it, to be sure. You say, okay, that's cool. So this guy's a foreign merchantman. He's going to have contact with underpinning belief systems from other civilizations. That's all great. So how does this dude then become this Mac Daddy of what's going to be the world's first global religion? How does that work? How does that happen? Whether fact or fiction, we don't really know, but evidently what began to occur to Muhammad is he was undergoing a series of visitations and visions, visitations by important individuals to other spiritual systems themselves, like the angel Gabriel, and that it was made known to Muhammad that the Most High God had appointed him the last and greatest of the prophets, that those that had come before him, the Abrahams, Moseses, Jesus of the world, all exceptional prophets in their own right, but he was determined to be the last and greatest of them, and that he was instructed, therefore, to go ahead and present these teachings about a single, highest, most high God. We're talking about an absolute monotheism here. So through these visions, through these visitations, Muhammad was selected as the last and greatest prophet. He's the man, and it's his job to go spread this message. One might imagine the difficult task or special burden that Muhammad's been given here. I mean, I guess I could go out here on 3rd Street on campus and start telling people that I'm like the last and greatest prophet of this Most High God, and that all of you should just listen to what I have to say, right? Because none of you would have a problem with that. None of you would give me dirty looks. Little men in white jackets with clipboards wouldn't be called out to come chase me about campus, right? This is crazy. But this cat right here, he is going to embrace this mission, and he's going to carry it out. An incredible story, to be sure, because at many places, many junctions throughout his life, he's going to be threatened to be killed. I mean, outright killed. While it won't happen overnight, and while he will be heavily ridiculed, Muhammad will begin to win converts. In fact, so many converts that he's now perceived as a threat in Mecca. Through the pleadings of individuals, his followers asking him to migrate to Medina to help settle some tribal disputes amongst Arabs there, and according to divine direction that Muhammad was given, he is to leave Mecca and go to Medina. This flight, as it's called, which really isn't a flight, it's his way of leaving, whether divine or to protect his own personal well-being. He will travel to Medina. This is known as the Hijra or Hijra, this act of movement or migration. It will be important to all Muslims to be sure. But this act or movement from Mecca to Medina will arguably perhaps save his life and becomes very instrumental and very important to Muslims. Rather than go deeper into Muhammad's personal story, and it is a most compelling one, and I'd ask those that are interested, research it, I will pivot from Muhammad the Prophet to Muhammad the Prophet's message now, and where it's captured. His teachings will be captured and brought together into this book known as the Quran. Written down some 6 centuries after the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, after the age of Augustus in Rome, we see the teachings of Muhammad encapsulated in this text known as the Quran. It is revealed within the Quran the absolute monotheism that is Islam. There is one Most High God, that is Allah, and individuals are to regulate all actions according to Allah. We have seen this in other spiritual systems. For the Fahavahar in Zoroastrianism, those wings, the feathers on the wings, the layers of the wings, good thoughts, good deeds, good actions. We've seen this in other spiritual systems or philosophies. Buddhism, right thought, right action, right intention, that eightfold path. So there's some commonalities here. Not saying that Muhammad borrowed from them, but perhaps it does reveal more about likenesses in spiritual systems that exist today than the differences. Likenesses aside, there are always going to be people that have different spiritual differences that don't like one another, then as now. And there is a degree of conquest that we see associated with Islam. That is evident in this map. Look at the size, scale, and growth of this first world religion. In fact, if we overlay it with the Byzantine Empire map, you can see that much of the Byzantine Empire is now going to be Islamic, Muslim, not Christian. And this is going to create an administrative nightmare in some sense for the Byzantines themselves. The height of Muslim expansion will be about 750. This will occur under the Umayyad Caliphates, the second of four major caliphates that are established after the death of Muhammad. And I want to draw your attention to the west, most specifically through Spain and France. If you see that battle site up at Tours, I want you to keep that in the back of your mind, because when we talk about the re-emergence of the West, the re-emergence of the Frankish people, we're going to talk about the conflict between Christianity and Islam at the Battle of Tours, and the Battle of Tours will be very impactful, to be sure. Now, I mentioned that the Umayyads were the second of four major caliphates after the death of Muhammad. We'll take a second here to talk about the Umayyads, the second caliphate, and those that will replace the Umayyads, the Abbasids, that third caliphate. And important to look at these two in the context of the scope of this course, the rise of Western Europe, and in Christianity as well. While Umayyads will come into contact with and conflict with Byzantine Christians, they're also going to have to deal with large populations of Christians within their claimed lands as well. As it relates to their governance of Christian peoples, while they did not force conversion to Islam, for those in the Christian faith and Judaism and the Jewish faith, for those that didn't convert, they were required to pay a special head tax known as a jizya. You had to pay this tax in order to continue to practice your spiritual faith of choice. For Muslims too, what might be perceived as intolerance by the Umayyads, the Umayyads firmly believed that only Arabs were true citizens. Therefore, if you weren't Arab, if you were Syrian, if you were Ethiopian, whatever it might be, you were not considered a true citizen. And therefore, there were different rules and taxes and laws that applied to you as well. Therefore, for Christians, Jews, and Muslims of non-Arab ethnic descent, this Umayyad leadership was seen to be a little bit intolerant here. In fact, a little bit too militant for their liking. Because of this, and for other reasons, we're going to see a revolution take place within the Umayyads, and it's known as the Abbasid Revolution. This Abbasid family is going to overthrow the Umayyad Caliphate and start a new caliphate of its own. Unlike the Umayyads, who were much less tolerant, Abbasid focus will be on what? Tolerance. And as a result of that, we're going to see this dynasty or this caliphate last several hundred years. In fact, it's going to cover what we remember as Islam's golden age. Another example from history showing that rule through toleration, rather than rule through fear, can equal longer-term civilizations and empires. Because the Abbasid dynasty is bookended by the Battle of Tours on one end, its beginning, and its ultimate destruction at the hands of these folks known as the Mongols, or Mongolian Golden Horde, we will save that discussion about the Abbasids for later lectures. I would be remiss, however, ridiculously remiss, if I didn't make mention of Harun al-Rashid. Harun al-Rashid is still remembered today as Harun the Just, Harun the Upright, Harun the Rightly Guided. This is an individual that was a polymath. He's an individual that's interested in all sorts of stuff. He wants to pursue scientific, cultural pursuits, push Islamic art, music, the arts and sciences together. In fact, he helps create the Beit el-Hikmah, or House of Wisdom. This is the place where, next to that former city of Alexandria, where we had the great library of Alexandria before it burned, all the new learning, all the new records, all the new mathematics and science, all of that's going to be housed at the Beit el-Hikmah. In Baghdad, he will move the capital from Damascus in Syria to Baghdad. Baghdad will be the place to go if you wanted the best education in the world. Islam's golden age will be achieved and at its peak under the height of Harun al-Rashid, largely because of his focus on the arts, on tolerance, on science, on trade, and on the individual. With the individual in mind, and as a way to start a transition from these caliphates to the individuals within the Nation of Islam, or Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam, I wanted to focus on the individual and the sort of spiritual aspects as it relates to the individual, him or herself. While each individual's spiritual journey is going to be helped and directed by these 5 pillars or 5 tenets of Islam, which we'll talk about in a minute, it really is tahara, or this inner purification, this inner perfection, that is the focus of Islam. As we've seen in other spiritual systems or philosophies, and as we'll see when we talk about Christianity next, that Christian principle of don't go pulling the stick out of someone else's eye when you have a beam in your own, the idea here is to get oneself right first. Don't worry about your neighbor. Get yourself perfect first. And if you can achieve that perfection, then you can go look to your neighbor. Most of us would recognize today it's an impossibility to be perfect. Therefore, what's the message? Don't worry about your neighbor, worry about yourself. Be pure, be a good example, be a good mentor, be a good guide, be a good soul. That's your mission. And if you do those things, that gives honor to Allah, or the Most High God. That's your purpose. That's your role. Be an example. Don't be a problem. A jihad or spiritual war does exist, therefore, but it's within the individual. This is the greater jihad, achieving self-perfection. Only when and if an individual could achieve self-perfection could you then move to the lesser jihad, which is the conversion, forcible or otherwise, of your neighbors who don't share the same sort of spiritual beliefs. What's the message? Probably never going to see a lesser jihad in this life unless you're an individual who is outside the faith. Important to consider. Thus, for those claiming the lesser jihad today, it's likely more for their own personal gain than it is to give glory to Allah. For most Muslims who are pursuing this self-perfection, there are some central tenets or 5 main pillars to help them on their spiritual journey, to help guide their spiritual walk. While I'm not going to go into each one of these pillars, I've provided some real basic information here, and I would encourage those that are interested to read further, research further. I will ask a question rather than perhaps throw out any more information. And the question simply is this: within these 5 pillars and aspects of each of these pillars, do we see likenesses with other spiritual systems or philosophies that we've bumped into so far? What might you see that is the same? Just a question for everyone to consider. As we begin to wind down this lecture on Islam now, this first part of Lecture 7, I wanted to take a minute to also talk about the different denominations or differences within Islam as well. This is important to understand. Just as there are different denominations in the Christian world today, Catholics and Protestants, and then underneath the Protestant umbrella we have all sorts of denominations: Episcopalians, Anglicans, Baptists, Methodists, Lutherans, you name it, right? There are also differences within Islam as well: Sunni, Shia, Sufi, and others. Therefore, when we talk about different spiritualities, it's important to understand that yes, there is a larger spiritual system, but there's also different denominations or ways that individuals practice their faith within those larger systems as well. Something to keep in mind as we move forward. Differences from within Islam aside, and as a way to conclude here, what was it that caused so many people to be attracted to Islam? And while I've listed a few points here, hardly an exhaustive list, I would pull out point 2. Whether you be Christian, Jew, or a follower of Zarathustra, this was a religion that wasn't much different than you already knew or embraced, and therefore made it easy to accept. Thus, while we will be talking about Islam moving forward in subsequent lectures, I hope this is a good base to build from. Dr. JC out from Islam.